Aunt Lena left in the blue hour before dawn, with nothing but a single suitcase and me, a 5-year-old burrito wrapped in my favorite blanket, asleep in the passenger seat of a rusting Corolla. She did not look back at the peeling bungalow on Sycamore Street. She focused on the road ahead, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her jaw set in a line so tight it looked painful. The leaving was not the hard part. The hard part had been the years before, the careful calculus of survival that governed our lives. I learned early to read the weather in his footsteps, the heavy, deliberate thud that meant he'd had a bad day at the shop, the silence that was more dangerous than shouting. I learned the geography of safe spaces, the broom closet I could fit into, the crawl space access in my bedroom ceiling, the path through the neighbor's yard to Mrs. Gable's back porch. I learned that love was a volatile substance, something that could be offered with a rough head pat one moment and withdrawn with a backhand the next. Aunt Lena was my moon. Her love was constant, but it operated in phases. There was the bright, cheerful phase when he was gone, full of whispered stories and secret pancakes for dinner. There was the careful waxing phase when he was home, her voice softening, her movements becoming smaller, trying to take up less space, to be less of a target. And there was the dark, hidden phase after an episode, when she'd move stiffly, her smile a fragile thing held together with pure will, her eyes avoiding mine as she applied concealer to bruises in shades of plum and mustard. The final argument wasn't about anything important. It was about the salt. He said the potatoes were undersalted. She said she'd salted them. He threw the bowl. The porcelain exploded against the wall above my head, showering me with gravy and ceramic shards. I didn't cry. I just froze. A piece of potato stuck to my cheek. Lena didn't scream. She didn't even look at the mess. She looked at me, at the terror I was too numb to express. And then she looked at him, at the triumphant, righteous anger on his face. Something in her broke, not into pieces, but into something harder. Get in your room, Leo. Pack your blue backpack. Just the important things. We left 3 hours later, after he'd passed out in front of the TV. We drove for 8 hours to a city where she knew no one. We lived in a motel that rented by the week, with walls so thin we could hear our neighbors cough. She got a job as a waitress at a diner, her feet aching, her smile pinned on for tips. We ate a lot of soup and grilled cheese, the diner's leftovers. It was the happiest I had ever been. The fear was a receding tide, leaving behind strange new shores of peace. The silence in our room was just silence, not the prelude to a storm. But the judgment from the world we'd left behind arrived by phone and mail, relentless and sanctimonious. Her mother, my grandmother, Lena, you took vows, for better or worse. He's a good provider. All men have their tempers. You're destroying this family. Her sister, my other aunt, think of Leo. He needs a father. You're being so selfish. What will people say? Family friends via forwarded emails and church prayer chains. We're praying for Lena's rebellious spirit. Marriage is a sacred covenant. She's throwing away God's plan for a little difficulty. The word abuse was never used by them. It was difficulty. It was his temper. It was you must have provoked him. The narrative was clear. She was the quitter, the destroyer of homes, the selfish woman who couldn't endure. Lena took the calls in the motel's payphone lobby, her back to me, her shoulders hunched. She'd hang up and sit for a minute, staring at the graffiti on the wall. Then she'd turn, paste on a smile, and say, "Who's ready for a grilled cheese adventure?" She absorbed their poisoned darts so they wouldn't hit me. She was my shield, even as her own armor was cracking under the assault. I started first grade in a new school. When the teacher asked me to draw my family, I drew a big yellow car and 2 stick figures inside. No house, no father. She asked where my daddy was. I said, we left him. The other kids, parroting their parents, called me names. Homewrecker's kid. No dad, Leo. Aunt Lena found me crying behind the slides. She didn't tell me they were wrong. She knelt in the wood chips, held my face, and said, "Listen to me. We did not wreck a home. A home is where you feel safe. We were in a war zone. We are builders, Leo. We are building a new home, you and me. And it is slow and it is hard, but every brick is laid with love, not fear. Remember that." She was my blueprint. She taught me that leaving wasn't an act of destruction. It was the first, bravest act of construction. But the world outside our tiny, fragile construction site was full of inspectors who condemned our plans, who valued the appearance of a standing house over the safety of its crumbling foundation. We were builders in a town that worshipped ruins. The diner tips bought us a deposit on a 1-bedroom apartment over a laundromat. It smelled perpetually of fabric softener and damp concrete, but it had a deadbolt Lena installed herself and a window in my nook that looked out on a maple tree. This was our fortress, our kingdom. We furnished it with sidewalk finds and thrift store treasures, each item a victory. A wobbly bookshelf held our library of paperbacks from the free bin. A scratchy orange couch became a pirate ship, a castle, a spaceship. Lena worked double shifts. I became a latchkey kid at age 7, trusted with a key on a string around my neck and a list of rules longer than my arm. Don't answer the door. Don't use the stove. Call Mrs. Gable, our new, kind downstairs neighbor, if you're scared. I'd let myself in, the snick of the deadbolt a satisfying solid sound. I'd do my homework at the Formica table, the hum of the laundromat dryers a constant white noise. I learned to make sandwiches, to tidy up, to be quiet and small so the landlord wouldn't notice a child living alone for hours. I was learning a different kind of endurance. The judgment didn't stop. It evolved. It was in the pitying looks from other parents at school events where Lena, in her waitress uniform smelling of coffee and grease, was the only one who'd rushed over on a break. It was in the whispers at the parent-teacher conference when she explained, calmly, that there was no father to list on the emergency contact form. The teacher, a well-meaning woman with a pearl necklace, suggested gently that a male role model might be beneficial for a boy my age, as if any man was better than none, as if the one we'd left hadn't been a lesson in terror. Lena's politeness in these moments was a steel wall. "We're managing just fine, thank you." She never explained, never justified. She had stopped trying to convince the world. Her energy was for us, for the architecture of our new life. She enrolled in night classes at the community college, studying bookkeeping. "Numbers are clean, Leo," she'd tell me, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes alight. "They add up or they don't. There's no yelling, no interpretation." I'd fall asleep to the sound of her calculator clicking, a metronome of her determination. The legal battles were a slow, draining bleed. He fought the divorce, not because he wanted her back, but because possession was his religion. He contested custody, painting Lena as an unstable, runaway wife who was alienating his son. We had to go to court. I was 8. A woman with a kind voice and too much perfume asked me questions in a small room. "Do you love your daddy?" I looked at my shoes. I knew the right answer, the answer that would make the adults nod, but I heard Lena's voice in my head. "We are builders of truth." "I'm scared of him," I whispered. "Why, honey?" "He breaks things. He made my mom bleed." The words were stones in my mouth. It was enough. Supervised visits were ordered, once a month. They were held in a sterile family services room with toys no one wanted to play with. He'd sit across from me, his anger a low-frequency hum in the air, and ask me questions about school, his voice too loud, too jovial. I'd give monosyllabic answers, counting the minutes on the wall clock. He never touched me. He just stared, as if trying to memorize a belonging he'd misplaced. After a year, he stopped showing up. The checks for child support, never generous, became sporadic, then ceased. Lena didn't chase him. "Cheaper to be poor and free," she said, closing the ledger. The absence of money was a constant gnawing pressure. The absence of him was a luxury we reveled in. We developed our own language, our own rituals. Pajama Sundays, where we'd read all day. Adventure Saturdays, where we'd take the bus to the end of the line and explore a new neighborhood, sharing a bag of pretzels. Our love wasn't the dramatic, volatile thing I'd first known. It was something steadier. It was showing up. It was her checking my math homework. It was me leaving the least burnt piece of toast for her. It was a shared, silent understanding in a movie when a character raised their voice and we'd both flinch, then share a look that said, "We're safe now." When I was 10, I got into a fight at school. A kid named Ryan, whose dad coached the soccer team and drove a new SUV, had been taunting me for weeks. "Where's your dad, Leo? Jail?" That day, he said, "My mom says your mom is a slut who ran off." I saw red. I didn't think. I launched myself at him. It was a short, messy scuffle of grabbed collars and ineffectual punches before a teacher pulled us apart. We were both sent to the principal's office. Ryan, crying, said I'd attacked him for no reason. I sat in furious, trembling silence. Lena was called. She arrived, still in her work apron, her face pale. The principal, Mr. Henderson, was stern. "Leo initiated unprovoked violence. We have a zero-tolerance policy, Ms. Reyes. This is very serious." Lena looked at me. "Is that true, Leo? Was it unprovoked?" I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, hot tears of shame and rage spilling over. She turned back to Mr. Henderson. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "My son has a zero-tolerance policy for being called the son of a slut, and so do I. What is your policy for children who use that kind of language?" Mr. Henderson blinked. The narrative had shifted. Ryan, under new questioning, admitted his words. We both got detention, but walking out of the school, Lena's hand on my shoulder was firm. "You shouldn't have hit him, but Leo, you defended me. You defended us." There was no anger in her voice. There was a fierce, sad pride. "Next time, use your words. They're sharper than fists, and they leave a different kind of mark." That night, over a dinner of boxed mac and cheese, she said, "The world will always have Ryans, people who judge what they don't understand, who think a broken family is worse than a dangerous one. Our job is to know who we are. We are builders, we are survivors, and we are kind, even when they are not, especially then, because we know what it costs to be cruel." I looked at her, this woman who worked until her feet swelled, who fought silent battles with court papers and budgets, who carried the judgment of a world that preferred pretty lies to ugly truths. She was the strongest person I knew, and she was teaching me that strength wasn't about enduring blows. It was about choosing the ground on which you stood. It was about building something so true, so solidly yours, that the judgments of others just echoed off its walls, powerless and faint. Adolescence in our built world was a different beast. The fears were less about sudden violence and more about the slow, creeping anxieties of poverty and difference. While my friends got allowances, I got a Saturday job shelving books at the library. While they worried about dating, I worried about Lena's cough that lingered all winter because she wouldn't take a day off to see a doctor. Our love was a practical, bustling thing, less about hugs and more about making sure the other had eaten. Lena finished her bookkeeping certificate and got a job at a small accounting firm. The pay was better, the hours more regular. We moved to a slightly better apartment, one with 2 bedrooms and no laundromat hum. It felt like a palace. We painted my room a terrible, brilliant blue. It was ours. But the ghost of the life we'd left behind had a long shadow. It manifested in my own relationships. My first girlfriend, Sarah, was sweet and loud. She came from a family that bickered over the dinner table and made up before dessert. The first time she raised her voice in playful argument, I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird remembering its cage. I shut down, went silent and distant. She was confused, then hurt. Why do you just clam up? It's like you're not even here. I couldn't explain that to me. Raised voices weren't a prelude to making up. They were a prelude to breaking things. We didn't last. I talked to Lena about it haltingly, staring at the orange couch that had seen so many of our truths. I don't know how to do it, I confessed. How to argue, how to be angry with someone without expecting everything to shatter. She was quiet for a long time, mending a hole in my sweater. I don't either, mijo, she said softly. I never learned. I went from my father's house to his. My blueprint for love was drawn by architects of control. She put the mending down. But you have a chance to draw your own. You know what the foundation has to be. Safety, respect, the freedom to say, this hurts me, without getting hit. Start there. The rest, we'll figure it out as we go, together. Her honesty was my compass. She didn't pretend to have answers. She just promised we'd search for them. That was our love. It wasn't a finished, perfect house. It was a perpetual collaborative renovation. In high school, I met David. He was the friend who had become the brother I never had. His family was the chaotic, loving mess I'd always observed from the outside with a sort of wistful awe. His parents, Maria and Tom, fought about politics and whose turn it was to empty the dishwasher, but they also danced in the kitchen to old salsa records and kissed each other goodbye every morning. David's home was a symphony of noise, laughter, shouting, music, the dog barking. It was overwhelming, and I craved it. I spent more time there than at my own apartment. Maria would feed me, fuss over my grades, and ask questions Lena was often too tired to ask. "How is your heart, Leo?" she'd say, pointing a wooden spoon at me. "Not your head, your heart." It was there, at David's cluttered dinner table, that I began to see the shape of what I'd missed. It wasn't just the absence of fear, it was the presence of a joyful, unafraid connection. One night, David's parents had a blowout fight. It started over something trivial and escalated, voices rising, Spanish and English flying. David rolled his eyes and dragged me to his room to play video games. "They'll be fine in 20 minutes, he said, unfazed. And they were. 30 minutes later, we came out to find them slow dancing in the living room to a quiet ballad, Maria's head on Tom's shoulder, the fight forgotten, absorbed into the resilient fabric of their love. I walked home that night under a sky full of stars, the echo of their laughter in my ears. I let myself into our quiet, orderly apartment. Lena was on the couch, asleep over a spreadsheet, her glasses slightly askew. I put a blanket over her and sat in the dark thinking. I had thought Lena taught me only what to run from, but watching David's family, I realized she had also taught me the essential precondition for the love they had, the right to leave. Maria and Tom fought fiercely because they knew on a cellular level that the other would stay. Their bond was elastic because it was voluntary. Ours with my father was a chain, rigid and brittle. Lena broke the chain. In doing so, she didn't just give us safety. She gave me the knowledge that love, real love, is a choice you make every day, not a prison sentence you endure. When I was 17, my father resurfaced. Not in person, but through a lawyer. He was dying. Liver failure. The message was a demand cloaked as a request. He wanted to see me, to make amends. I showed the letter to Lena. Her face went ashen, then stony. She handed it back. "This is your decision, Leo. Only yours. I will support whatever you choose. But I need you to know you owe him nothing. Not your time, not your forgiveness, not a single moment of your peace. That is the power we built." I thought about it for a week. I thought about the bowl of potatoes, the sound of the porch door splintering, the hidden phases of the moon. And I thought about the quiet apartment, the library job, the blue room, the patient, unwavering love of the woman who slept on the couch. I wrote a one-sentence reply through the lawyer. "I have nothing to say to him. Do not contact me again." Sending it felt like bolting a final, heavy door. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was a simple, administrative act of boundary setting. It was the practical application of Lena's greatest lesson. You are allowed to choose who has access to your life. At my high school graduation, Lena sat alone in the bleachers. She wore a new dress, bought on sale, and cried unabashedly the whole time. David's family hooped and hollered when my name was called. Afterwards, as we all milled about on the football field, Maria engulfed Lena in a massive hug. "You did it, Hermana," she said, her own eyes wet. "You got him here." Lena, uncomfortable with the praise but glowing with pride, just nodded. On the drive home, she was quiet. Then she said, You know, when we left, I thought I was giving you a life with less. Less money, less stability, less family. I only saw the subtraction. She pulled into our parking spot and turned to me, her face serious in the dashboard light. But I was wrong. I wasn't giving you less. I was giving you the foundation, the one non-negotiable thing. Everything good that comes into your life now, your friends, your future, any love you find, it will land on solid ground. It won't have to grow in cracked earth. That's what I gave you. In that moment, I saw the full scope of her architecture. She hadn't just built us a shelter, she had surveyed the treacherous land of inherited trauma, drained the swamp of fear, and poured a foundation of absolute safety. It was the one thing her critics, with their vows and their judgments, had never understood. They prized the appearance of a standing house. She knew a home was only as strong as what it was built upon, and she had chosen, with breathtaking courage, to start from bedrock. College was a scholarship to a state university 3 hours away. Leaving our apartment felt like stepping off a lifeboat onto a vast, stable shore I'd only ever read about. The dorm was chaotic, a cacophony of new voices and freedoms. I thrived in the noise. I studied psychology, a choice Lena fully supported. Understand the machinery, she said, so you can fix what's broken in yourself and maybe in others. I called her every Sunday. Our conversations were no longer about survival logistics, but about ideas. She'd tell me about the small business clients she was helping at the firm, proud of being the person who kept their dreams solvent. I'd tell her about my classes, about the theories of attachment and trauma that explained our past with clinical clarity. We were translating our lived experience into a shared language of understanding. The wound was becoming a subject of study, and in studying it, we gained a new kind of distance from its pain. I brought friends home on breaks. Our small apartment, which had once felt like a fortress against the world, now felt like a warm, slightly shabby sanctuary. My friends loved Lena. They saw her quiet strength, her sharp, dry wit, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed. They didn't see the ghost of the woman who'd applied concealer in the dark. They saw the architect. One of those friends was Ben. Ben was from a picture-perfect suburb, his parents still happily married, his childhood a curated album of vacations and academic achievements. He was my polar opposite, and we became close. He was fascinated by my family, or lack thereof, in the way someone is fascinated by a survival manual for a disaster they've never faced. During our junior year spring break, Ben came home with me. We were sitting at the kitchen table, Lena making us her famous, to us, struggle soup, a hearty, cheap vegetable stew, when Ben asked a question that was innocent on its surface, but landed like a stone in the quiet room. Lena, if you don't mind me asking, do you ever regret it? Leaving, I mean. It must have been so hard, starting with nothing. I stiffened. It was the question underneath all the old judgments, the one even well-meaning people couldn't resist. The question that assumed the hard part was the leaving, not the staying. Lena didn't pause in her stirring. She'd been asked versions of this for 15 years. But this time, she turned, leaning against the counter, and looked not at Ben, but at me. She was answering him, but her words were a gift to me, a final piece of the blueprint. Regret? She said, her voice thoughtful. No, I regret that I had to. I regret that the person who vowed to love me chose to terrorize me. I regret that my son learned fear before he learned to ride a bike. But the act of leaving, no, Ben, that was the first true thing I did for myself and for Leo. She ladled soup into bowls, the steam fogging her glasses. People talk about endurance like it's the highest virtue in a marriage. She endured so much, as if enduring poison is nobler than finding an antidote. What I was enduring wasn't love. It was the systematic destruction of my spirit. Every day I stayed, I was teaching my son that love looks like walking on eggshells, that a man's anger is a woman's responsibility to manage, that fear is a normal household ingredient like salt. She brought the bowls to the table and sat down. The hard part wasn't the motel or the diner or the lawyers. The hard part was the before. The hard part was lying awake next to a man I feared, listening to my child breathe in the next room, and wondering if tonight would be the night his rage turned a more final corner. The hard part was the profound loneliness of being trapped in a life that looked normal from the outside. Ben was silent, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He was witnessing a testimony. Leaving, Lena continued, her gaze steady, wasn't the catastrophe. It was the triage. It was stopping the bleeding. Everything after, the poverty, the judgment, the exhausting work, that was the recovery. Difficult, painful, but life-giving. So no, I don't regret the medicine just because it was bitter to swallow. She picked up her own spoon. What I have now, this peace, this quiet, this relationship with my son, it's not despite leaving, it's because of it. This is the life I was saving us for. The room was quiet, except for the soft slurp of soup. Ben finally nodded, a look of dawning, humbled comprehension on his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft, "for explaining that to me." Later, as we drove Ben to the train station, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My parents, they love each other, but they've had rough patches. My mom always says, you have to fight for your marriage. I always thought that meant fighting with each other, to stay together no matter what." He looked out the window. But your mom, she fought for something, for safety, for a real life. She fought by leaving. I never thought of it that way, that leaving could be the bravest form of fighting for your family. His words hit me with unexpected force. He was right. The world had framed Lena as a quitter, but she was a warrior. She just fought a different kind of war. A war of extraction, of evacuation, of building a new camp on safer ground. Her weapon wasn't endurance, but the radical, terrifying courage to say no more. A few months later, I got a late-night call from Ben. His voice was thick, shaky. Through halting sentences, I pieced it together. Ben's picture-perfect sister, Claire, was in a hospital. Her picture-perfect husband had put her there. A shoving match that had sent her down a flight of stairs. It wasn't the first time, Ben confessed. It was just the first time it couldn't be hidden. The family was reeling, whispering about counseling, about not giving up, about how much he loved her really. He was just under stress. I talked to my parents, Ben said, a sob cracking his voice. I told them about your mom, about what she said about triage, about fear not being a normal ingredient. My dad got quiet. My mom started crying. They're at the hospital now. I think they're telling Claire she can come home, for as long as she needs, no questions asked. He took a shivering breath. Leo, thank your mom for me, please. She doesn't know it, but she just gave my sister a ladder out of hell. I hung up, my heart aching for Claire, for Ben, for the picture-perfect picture that had shattered to reveal the rotten frame, and I felt a surge of something fierce and proud for Lena. Her truth, hard-won and paid for in loneliness and judgment, had just become a lifeline for a stranger. Her blueprint was no longer just for us. It was being photocopied in an emergency room, a guide for another family facing the unthinkable. Her courage was rippling outward, changing the story. 10 years later, the one-bedroom apartment was a memory. Lena lived in a tidy condo she'd bought herself, her bookkeeping business stable and respected. I had a place across town, working as a therapist, specializing in trauma and family systems. Our Sundays were now spent over long brunches, discussing her clients' quirks and the general state of the world. The past was a country we'd both emigrated from, its borders firmly closed. My own life was built on the foundation she'd poured. I was in a healthy relationship with Maya, a writer whose emotional vocabulary was as precise as her prose. We had disagreements, sometimes loud ones, but they were contained, resolvable. The fear of shattering never entered the room. We had drawn our blueprint together, and the first line was respect. The second was the unspoken, non-negotiable right to leave. It made staying a daily, joyous choice. Ben's sister, Claire, had divorced. She'd spent a year in Lena's old room at her parents' house, healing. She was now a fierce advocate at a women's shelter, her smile easy again, but her eyes held a depth they hadn't before. Ben and his parents had become quietly vocal in their community, correcting the "why doesn't she just leave" narrative with a simple "let me tell you about the cost of staying." One rainy Thursday, Lena called, her voice unusually tentative. Ben left a message. He asked if he could come see me, said he had something to say. Should I be worried? No, I said, a smile in my voice. I think you should let him. Ben arrived at her condo on Saturday afternoon, bearing a ridiculous bouquet of sunflowers and a bottle of fancy olive oil. He was nervous, shifting from foot to foot in her neat living room. Lena, I don't know how to start this, he began, clutching the oil like a lifeline. I've wanted to say this for years, since that spring break, but after what happened with Claire, it became more urgent. Lena gestured for him to sit, her face calm but curious. You probably don't even realize, Ben said, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. That conversation you had with me, about triage, about endurance not being a virtue when you're enduring poison, it rewired my brain. I'd been fed this steady diet of fight for your family at all costs, and I watched my parents do that. But they were fighting for each other, not against each other. I never understood the difference until you spelled it out. He took a breath. When it happened, my parents' first instinct was the old script. Marriage is hard, he's a good provider, he's sorry. But I heard your voice in my head. I sat them down and I repeated what you said, almost word for word, about fear not being a normal household ingredient, about the loneliness. I told them that by asking her to endure, they were asking her to live in a war zone, and that love shouldn't be a war zone. He looked at her, his eyes bright. It changed everything for them. It gave them permission to put her safety above the sanctity of a broken vow. It gave Claire permission to save herself. You gave her that, Lena. You gave us the language we didn't have. He wiped at his eyes, embarrassed. So thank you. Not just for Leo, for being such an amazing mom to him, but for my family, for Claire. You taught me that love isn't about how much you can endure. It's about what you're willing to protect. It's about choosing safety and dignity and a life where fear isn't the wallpaper. That's the most important thing anyone has ever taught me. The room was quiet, filled only with the sound of rain against the window. Lena sat very still. She had spent decades absorbing judgment, wearing the label of the woman who broke her family. She had built a life of quiet integrity in the face of that condemnation, brick by brick, for us. She never expected a thank you. She certainly never expected her choices to become a lifeline thrown into another family's storm. A single tear traced a clean path down her cheek. She didn't sob, she just let it fall. Then she reached out and took Ben's hand, her grip firm. "You're welcome," she said, her voice thick but clear. "And thank you, Ben, for telling me, for seeing it." After he left, Lena and I stood on her small balcony, watching the rain cleanse the city. She was quiet for a long time. "All those years," she finally said, her gaze distant. "The whispers, the prayers for my rebellious spirit, my own mother telling me I was destroying God's plan. I thought the only ones who would ever understand were you and me, in our little lifeboat." She turned to me, her face a map of hard-won peace. "But we weren't just in a lifeboat, were we? We were building a lighthouse, and I didn't even know it. I was just trying to keep the light on for us." I put my arm around her shoulders, feeling the familiar, strong slope of them. "You did more than that, Mom. You built the lighthouse on the most solid ground you could find. You showed everyone lost in that particular storm what safe ground looks like. Ben, Claire, me, everyone who hears our story." She leaned her head against mine. We stood there, two builders surveying their work. The condo, the career, the peace were the visible structure, but the real legacy, the unshakable foundation, was the lesson now echoing in other lives, that love is not a test of endurance, it is an act of protection. That leaving a war zone is not a defeat, it is the first vital victory. That a family is not defined by its persistence in pain, but by its commitment to each other's safety and dignity. The rain slowed to a drizzle. The world looked clean, washed. The fear was gone, not just from our home, but from the blueprint we now carried into the future. It had been replaced by something sturdier, something born not from vows spoken in a church, but from a choice made in the blue hour before dawn, the choice to build and to keep building on bedrock.